So moving on, so another of the bills that we emphasized was about redistricting, and we have two of the sponsors, Senator Oyer and Representative Knight here. There was a lot that went on nationally with redistricting at the same time this bill was before the Assembly. I don't know if you want to quickly describe what the bill you put in would do briefly, and you can tell everybody its fate this year.
Sure. So it would create a citizen redistricting committee. So this is a bill that's supported not just by Common Cause, but also the League of Women Voters has been strongly in support of this bill. It's modeled after something they do in California, which is create a citizen-based redistricting commission. Now, what does that mean? That means folks who are eligible voters in the state of Rhode Island can basically apply to become, to sit on the redistricting committee. You would be screened for conflicts. So if you are an elected official, or if you are closely related to an elected official, you would not be eligible to serve on the redistricting committee. And then whoever is left over from that eligible pile of applicants would then be chosen by lottery. So it really is an attempt to try to take the politics out of the redistricting process. And, you know, like John said, redistricting is very much the topic of conversation around the country. And I think this bill is critically important because the very basic is that we need to have a citizenry that has confidence that every vote and their own vote is counting. And if there's feelings that, you know, the districts are going to be set up in a way where, you know, they're sectioning sections of voters together or disenfranchising people through the redistricting process, that's not good. So this is the second year that I have championed this bill. And it, you know, it got a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. They definitely were paying attention to what was happening on the national level, but unfortunately, it didn't move beyond the committee in the Senate.
In the same fate in the House.
Yeah, I mean, it got a hearing in the House, which is about all it got. It is I think it's hard. Basically what this bill does is asking people in power to let go of power, which is, for some folks, a difficult proposition. So this along with the line item veto, I sort of put in that category of like, it's a change, it's good, it's just hard to get people to swallow and make it happen. And citizens redistricting that would be a massive change for Rhode Island. So put the bill again, we'll have further conversation and just keep pushing that ball uphill because that's how it happens. But it is redistricting is like, it's the total inside baseball way of solidifying political power. You guys, obviously you guys are an informed audience, you know about this. What was the book that just came out about the Republican efforts nationally?
Yeah,
it had a filthy name, right?
Yeah, it was RAT and then
F, right?
The F word.
That's the book, and it's all about the decade-long effort by the Republicans to do what they're supposed to do, right?
Power. Is that mission?
It was
there was a
giant effort to grab the state houses prior to the last redistricting so they could solidify the Republican districts for Congress, right? And that's what redistricting is. Just it's such a powerful tool in the toolbox of whatever party's in power. To give it over to the civilians would be just a huge leap, but I think a really good thing for small d democracy.
And it's a tool that can be used to punch, and that's one of the things that I've enjoyed over the course of my political experience at the State House. This will be my third redistricting, and Jim, you've been through it as well. And I have seen districts altered so that it's virtually impossible for that incumbent to be reelected. They're being punished. It goes back to the idea of gerrymandering. It's specious, it needs to be changed, and it's needed to have been changed for a long, long time.
Which it's fun for me because I actually live on the district line. Across the street is Luna Palmas district, so we'll see what happens with me. But I will also say that in fairness to my colleagues, there was a lot of conversations that I had amongst other senators who were just really kind kind of a concern, and who maybe had gone through redistricting processes before, and typically what happens is, they bring in a consultant who does a lot of demographics and like reviews the census and kind of, works through the redistricting that way. And so I did definitely hear from colleagues who had been through the redistricting process and were quite honestly, well, how would this work? They were really, I think, concerned about where is the expertise going to come from around these conversations. And so I do think that, this year, like any piece of legislation, every year you have additional conversations that allows you to move the conversation forward and move the ball forward. And I think that there were definitely some of those conversations in the Senate. And also Senator Sheehan pointed out that I do want to clarify the mechanics of this is that it actually is not a piece of legislation, but it's technically a resolution that would actually lead to a ballot question, a constitutional amendment. So it would have to go through a ballot question of the public.
Which means if it ever got there, you guys would have this. You guys would have a say.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very powerful tool. I've seen 2 election cycles where redistricting essentially is people would be inclined, being in charge of the process, the legislative process, and unfortunately the Supreme Court of the United States, in a split decision, has said it's inherently a political process. So there's going to be no reprieve from the Supreme Court, who basically suggested to states that they do like what California did. What Michigan did is adopt these citizen redistricting commissions. Would take a constitutional amendment for us to do it, so it makes it more difficult, which also can beg the question whether or not we have enough issues like line item veto or others to dare to call for a constitutional convention. There's kind of arguments on both sides of that, but at some point it does put it out of the hands of the elected politicians and puts it kind of in a more of a citizen elected, wouldn't be politicians, but officials who would be elected to the convention and deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the Supreme Court. So just for people's common cause nationally was very involved in redistricting. So the main problem you're hearing about is partisan gerrymandering. There's 2 types: racial, which tends not to affect Rhode Island as much, and partisan, which affects all states because regardless of the demographics of the states, the 2 parties are fighting it out. And the Supreme Court, in a case called Common Cause v. Rucho, so we were the plaintiff in the case, decided in June that courts need to stay out of the question, or at least federal courts need to stay out of the question of is partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional or not. And the court, the majority, Chief Justice Roberts said, state legislatures can solve this problem. So he actually put it on us, on organizations like Common Cause in the 50 states, to solve the problem by going to the state legislatures and getting it solved there, or through ballot initiatives, which we don't have in Rhode Island. So hopefully, the fact that we can no longer hold out hope that the Supreme Court's going to come save us just means that there'll be more pressure on the legislature to do something about it. I want to just point out one other thing, which is then it's going to happen soon, right? So redistricting will happen in the spring of 2021. So next year is really the year I think this debate will come to a head. But redistricting happens after the census, and I want to say something about the census, even though I don't think any of the panelists were involved in this. So for those who don't know, the census happens in 2020. That data is then the foundation for redistricting, for apportioning the seats. And we were involved, Common Cause was involved in something that the legislature involved in the census, which is there is a statewide complete count committee. My partner in crime in that, Jessica David, is here. And we're members of this big 60-member statewide committee that is meeting, and it's part stakeholder groups like Common Cause and the Rhode Island Foundation and other groups, in part government, that's working together to try to convince Rhode Islanders to participate in next year's census. And we had an ask of the legislature of $500,000 that wouldn't flow to Common Cause, that would be spent by state government to hire a communications firm, among other things, to do marketing around the census. And that did make its way into the budget. Governor Raimondo had put about $150,000 in her budget, and then the House increased that to $500,000. So there was a win for us, so to speak, in the state budget. We are not normally a group that has our hand out in the state budget. It's actually kind of an uncomfortable position for a government watchdog group to be asking for money in the budget, but we were one of the groups that pushed for that $500,000, and we're grateful. It was in there because it's critically important, and I'll just give my really quick one-sentence stump. You know, it's not only a congressional seat, which is what a lot of people think about, but they all had to vote on a budget of about $10 billion. $3.8 billion of that comes from the federal government based on census formula. And so if we have bad deficits now, if we don't have a successful deficit or census, we're going to have bad or worse deficits in the future.
For two of your three issues, early voting and independent redistricting, the panel said that the concerns in the chambers were about unintended consequences, but then John and others also said that both of those were implemented in many other states with successful results of similar processes to what was being proposed. So I'm kind of curious about, does that resonate with the other members of the Assembly? And if not, why not? Why does Rhode Island have to be different if other states have successfully implemented these processes? What's the counter argument to that?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The key to successful passage of those bills is education, right? Rhode Island's Rhode Island. We, for better or for worse, we tend to be parochial, and I think it's sometimes we want to meaningfully sort of lift the veil from our eyes and see how it's done in other states and really take our lessons from there. So education, I think, on how those other states have handled these things is key.
And with the Progressive Caucus that has come into the House, and I was happy to come into the House with them, in a speech on the floor as we were closing, I did a shout out to the class of 2019 because we contributed, I think, to some very significant legislation being passed this year. But one of the problems is tradition. We have legislators who have been there for a long period of time, and they're jaded and fixed in their positions, and they're not going to move. So it's going to be important, I think, for citizens to look at who, in fact, is representing them and doing their best to bring in new blood into the chambers.
Thank you. I'm actually new to Rhode Island. I've been 35 years in that good government state called Massachusetts.
With a great governor.
Senator Hoyer, you were my senator. I was in Newport for a few months and then moved up the island. On these citizens' councils, it sounds like a great idea, like bringing the jury system to government, to selection of our districts. But I guess I want to follow up a little more on that, because I think it's a very serious question here. Have they actually been used in Michigan and California for redistricting, is my first question. And my second one is, as you pointed out, we have a redistricting in 2021. I doubt very much anything's going to get done in a year, which means it'll be 12 years. What can be done useful in the next year that might help the situation here a little bit?
Yeah, so I can try to answer that, and please jump in. But so the idea that you take it out of the politician's hand to do redistricting is largely about 20 years old, and really it was last cycle, so in 2010, 2011, that we saw it in practice. And we saw it in Arizona and California, most notably, although there are some other states that did it. And it was a success, right? It worked in California. It worked by a number of measures, including we saw increased competitiveness in the districts. A number of incumbents were placed in the same districts and had to fight it out because in the minds of the commission, the better district was the one that had them in the same district, right? It kept what are called communities of interest together. California had a very big problem because there's a lot of ethnic enclaves of those being split. So there's a Koreatown in LA County that had been split right down the middle. And so the Korean community felt they weren't being represented by any member of Congress. And similarly in Arizona, Michigan, Ohio, Utah, there were 5 states that passed changes last
2018.
In 2018. I'm forgetting the rest of the states, but that'll happen next cycle. And they're all a little different flavor. And Utah is more advisory, California is more binding. If it doesn't happen next year, and I'm not going to be too Pollyanna about it, that it likely won't happen, I think you're right, but there are things we can do to affect change nonetheless. So there is a public part of the existing process in Rhode Island. The General Assembly will have its commission, but they'll go around the state and they'll have public hearings. They had 28 last time, and I was one of the only people, if not the only person in the state who went to all 28. And there weren't a lot of people in the room with me. I think there'll be a lot more people in the room this time because I think people are paying closer attention than they were 10 years ago. And technology is on our side this time. So 10 years ago, technology was such that the people who draw the districts could manipulate them at a very fine grain. But this time, we can do it. So there are websites that you could log on your phone and draw districts that would be legally acceptable because the computing power has gotten that much better in just a decade. And so what we hope to do is empower citizens in Rhode Island to draw their own districts and go to those 28 public meetings and say, hey, here's my map, and it's better than your map. It's better than the official one, right? And call out the gerrymanders that they've seen over the decades, right? So there's literally a website that you could take their maps, the official ones, upload it, and it will score it on a number of different measures of fairness. And then we'll be able to say, listen, you score a 0, right? My map scores 100, so you should use my map. And I think there will be a type of pressure that there hasn't been in the past because the public can participate more fully. Okay.
So I think one of the things that's interesting is actually part of the kind of pushback that I got from some of my colleagues actually plays into your question about what can we do. One of the concerns that colleagues raised with me that I didn't mention earlier was that we will be putting this power in the hands of people who are unelected and therefore have no accountability to the citizens when they are taking on this task. And, I think that very much leaves open exactly what John was saying, in a representative democracy, staying involved and making sure that you're paying attention. And I think the unfortunate thing is, like John said, you get to some of these things that are very technical and very in the weeds, and people's eyes glaze over and stop being engaged. But this is one of those things that it's gained national attention. There's so much awareness because of the Supreme Court activity and kind of the misconduct on this issue around the country that I do agree that there's going to be a lot more attention on this, and I encourage all of you and all Rhode Islanders to really stay involved in that process. And I know Common Cause will do a good job at kind of explaining where those public opportunities are, but it's not just about going to those public open meetings, but also contacting your elected officials. So I'm sorry to lose you in Newport, but if you're in Senator DePalma or Senator Stephanie's district, I'm sure they would love to hear from you, because I think that's one thing that folks don't realize is while we get a huge volume of correspondence throughout the legislative session, and I'm quite frankly still catching up on that, I know we all read it and we all take it into consideration. And so, continuing to reach out, not just showing up at the public meetings, but following the process the whole way along is going to be really critical.
Yeah, thousands of emails from the last session. Read them all.
I read them all.
Still answering.